and welcome to Asia Down Under. Today we head off to the west coast back in time when the promise of gold beckoned and Chinese miners answered its call. Here's Glenna with that story.
This is Shantytown in Westland, a recreated 19th century pioneer town dedicated to the miners who sought their fortunes in the gold fields of the west coast. Some 5,000 prospectors lived in and around this area, including the towns of Hokitika and Greymouth. Shantytown's 30 historic buildings take us back to the 1860s, when Westland was a bustling, cosmopolitan society. It was a mix of miners from around the world, which included the Chinese, most of whom came from Guangdong province. Their earliest arrival in the west coast was in 1866. By the 1870s, the Chinese were the largest minority, and their lives are depicted here in Chinatown. A new book that chronicles the lives of the Chinese on the west coast has been written by Shantytowns researcher Julia Bradshaw.
The stories that people did know of were ones that they were reminiscences from, written down in the 70s, 1970s and 1980s, and they remembered sort of elderly Chinese miners when they were kids in the 1920s or 1910s. But when I started digging, I discovered that the story was quite different. There was a lot of Chinese miners from the 1870s onwards, and they were young and vibrant and really successful and fantastic miners, and that story hadn't really come through in the reminiscences that were around. So most of them, and especially in that early period, were incredibly successful. They did really well out of their mining claims, and they saved very carefully, and they would, within maybe 2 or 3 or 5 years, they would have £100, enough to go home, which they did. Well, one of the photos we do have is of Charlie Changling, who was a gold miner at Kamara. He's obviously doing quite well, got his photo taken, probably to send home. And then after he'd been in New Zealand for some time, he got enough money and he went home, but came back again, bringing his teenage son out with him, and set up another business in the North Island.
Compared with many of the settlers of the time, the Chinese were very well organized. At this reconstructed Chinese village here at Shantytown, Julia showed us just how they lived. So here we are. Can you tell me a little bit about the structures in this area?
Well, this here is a typical miner's hut for a miner who might live on his own. Mm-hmm. They had often quite Spartan structures, but usually comfortable enough. And then the miners who lived in groups often had quite a large communal hut. Sometimes some people called them barracks. And they might have between 4 and up to 12 people living in them that have a big communal fireplace, bunks, and whatever they needed to survive.
As soon as the Chinese set up their own little place, beside their claim, there would be a garden somewhere.
There'd definitely be a garden, and usually the other thing that they seemed to be well known for was running water to their camps was another unusual feature. Even if it meant apparently building the hut in the shade rather than the sun, they would rather have running water. So they actually used hollowed out panga logs and sometimes hollow logs to run water right to their camps, right into their huts. The general store was a really important part of the Chinese community, so anywhere that there was enough Chinese miners, there would be a Chinese store who would supply all the goods that they needed, including Chinese foods, but also shovels and picks and whatever they required. And then in the main towns, there'd be a really big Chinese store as well, which often supplied these smaller Chinese stores out at the mining camps.
Most of them were experts at alluvial mining, using water on loose soil to get to the gold. The process is called sluicing, and Shantytown has a gold claim where they demonstrate this method. But to get there, a nostalgic trip on an equally nostalgic ride. Julia, can you tell me how the Chinese miners would have used this train in the past?
Well, the main centres, Hokitika, Greymouth, Reefton and Westport, were connected by trains, so they would use the train to go backwards and forwards. And quite important for festivals, if they came down for the Chinese New Year festival or funerals, or a big group would come down on the train.
Right now, where are we headed?
We're heading up to the sluice claim, which is sluice claims were really common on the west coast, and the Chinese did a lot of sluicing. A sluice claim is where the miners would use a jet of pressurised water to blast away at an alluvial face, and the gravel, and hopefully there was some gold in it, it would all come down into a tail race, and there would be riffles in the tail race which would help to collect the gold, and all the rocks and things they didn't want would carry on through.